In this episode, we have Nikoline coming back to talk about green labs again, but this time more how do you make the practical changes to make labs more sustainable, be it labs in universities, hospitals, or private pharma companies. And there's some really exciting insights in there, including how you can actually get happier employees and save money with making labs more sustainable. So listen in, it's a good one. Welcome back, Nikoline. It's good to have you again. It was a pleasure doing the last episode with you on sustainable labs. And I highly recommend to go back and listen to that episode if you haven't already. For those who don't know you, who are you, Nikoline, and what do you work with?
Yeah, that's a good question. So who I am, that's a difficult one to answer, but professionally, yeah, that's a little, well, professionally I have a background as a biochemist. I did a PhD and a postdoc in basic research within the cancer or DNA damage field. Then I decided to combine laboratory research with sustainability in a way. So for the past 2 years, I've worked as a self-employed or independent value-driven green lab advisor or consultant, so to say. So I do a lot of workshops and talks and stuff, but also longer green lab projects with private companies, but also the University of Copenhagen. So that's like,
very cool.
That's the professional me.
A very precise wrap-up. Let's stick to the professional you from now on. I guess that's easier. Some of the things we talked about in the last episode was that there's an incredible sustainability potential in labs, both because they are polluting quite a bit themselves, single-use plastic, hazardous waste, these kind of things, but also because labs, especially in the pharmaceutical sector, creates massive lock-in effects, and through snowballing effects, they are often the foundation for how does the production of the drugs get approved in the end, and what happens at scale actually starts in the lab. But maybe if you could give a short recap of why are sustainable labs important?
I think ethically it's important because most of the work that we do in labs is supposed to create a better world. Not necessarily because we're doing applied research, but because we're like, maybe one day this knowledge will be useful for humanity. That's why most people go into a lab.
Yeah.
And right now, the greatest threat to humanity is climate change. So ethically, it just makes a lot of sense in the labs that we also take that into account.
Yeah.
Like, let's do all this, have this great societal impact, but with the smallest possible planetary impact. Yeah.
Yeah, no, summed it up really nicely. And in the labs, is it even possible to make labs more sustainable? Because as you said, there's a lot of things going on, and it's usually a different agenda you come in with. You're trying to gain some knowledge, move some research along, whether it's for making human health or better, or understanding nature better.
So whether it's possible or not?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Without compromising with those things.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely possible.
Yeah.
I think we can never have a zero-sum game. We can never become sustainable or regenerative or whatever in the labs because they are too resource intensive.
Yeah.
But we can definitely lower it, so it's a lot less resource intensive. And we can do that without compromising teaching or research. We can also do it while saving money and while improving workflows. So it's not just because it ethically makes sense or because we ought to be doing it. It's also because in many ways it is efficient lab work when we use the smallest possible input to get the same output. Yeah.
And that sounds like hell of a deal.
Yeah, it really is. Now
Yeah.
it's just about changing habits and doing things differently, and that's in principle easy, right? But practically that's really difficult.
So what do we need to do on a high level, do different in labs than what we do now?
On a high level, I think, first of all, it has to be prioritized in the sense that it takes time for people to get used to something new.
Yes.
Not necessarily because the new thing is more time consuming, but the transition between the current habits and the new, better, greener habits, that's going to take some time where you are less productive.
Yeah.
And that's not me saying that. That's like a change management point of view, right? We know that. It
all
takes
habit
time.
research, yeah.
Exactly. So it needs to be accepted that if we want to do things differently, there will be a transition phase where things are not as productive here. But on the other side of that curve, we might even be more productive.
Yeah.
So I think on a higher level, that's what we need to prioritize. So that means, like in academia, it would be group leaders, professors, all of these have to accept this and promote the change. And in pharmaceutical companies, for example, it has to be more like a management decision that, you know, people who are employed for this many hours, they are now allowed to spend the same amount of hours, but while being less productive, or they get 2 hours per week to implement new things. Or I think it's, in the end, it's very much about time at this point. It's about prioritizing that people can use the time.
It takes time to change the habits.
Exactly.
But what you're saying, once we get over there's an initial investment.
Exactly.
But then we can have the same output.
Yes.
With less input. Yeah. And what are the key bad inputs in a laboratory that we need to minimize?
You could say the different inputs that somehow have to do with the planet. So now I'm not talking about human resources or stress or time. That would be like water, electricity, heating, and then all the products that we consume in the labs. Yeah. And very often we're very focused on like heating and electricity because that's so easy to measure. Yes. But that's really the least of it. And also we look a lot at the garbage or the waste and the plastic. And again, that's not really, I mean, it's great if we deal with all of it, but what we really have to focus on is all the products that enter the lab. I think that's common to, at least many universities and pharmaceutical companies, that scope 3, so all the services, all the products that we consume, those are the things that really make up the largest proportion of the.
Definitely, and when you say scope 3, you're referring to the GHG protocol, where the divisions are divided into scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 being your own household or organization, so to speak, so what you consume in there, and scope 2 is the energy that you're buying, be it electricity or heating. And scope 3 is everything else that happens before and after you in the supply chain. And as I hear you, when it comes to labs, it's all the really the products that are going in.
Exactly.
And I guess that, I mean, maybe a stretchy comparison, but a bit like you would see it in the L. MacArthur butterfly, that once the things are in the loop, you've actually already lost. So sorting the waste afterwards,
exactly.
I mean, it's fine.
Yeah, but it's not going to change a lot. Yeah. Exactly. So I think in terms of what are the resources or the input that we really have to deal with, it's mostly all the products. So all the materials, all the regions. And there are two possible solutions to that, right? Yeah. Either all of these products become green. Yeah. So the manufacturers make other products that we can consume, or we simply don't use them. Yeah. And I think we will have to find and I think the only possible solution is a combination. Because we can't expect all manufacturers to change their products overnight, but we also cannot run the labs without using the products. Yeah. So the first thing we can do is to simply consume less. And not in the sense that we won't do all the research that we normally do, but like really evaluate how much do I need. And I think that's like, I will be unpopular from a manufacturer point of view for saying this, but all of their protocols, so the manufacturer's protocols, they are not made for us to consume as little as possible. They are made for us to consume as much as possible and to buy as much as possible. So very often for all of these regions and materials, you can use a lot less and still get the same great output. So that's also like the whole mindset of questioning the business as usual. So there's this protocol, could I do it differently? And
And if there's probably a lot of listeners who don't have their everyday life in a lab. What are some of the key products that goes into a lab?
Labs are very different, right?
Categories of products.
So for sure, there's a lot of plastic disposables. There's also, if it's a lab working with cells, like could be bacterial cells or could be mammalian cells or whatever. There will be a lot of medium, like liquids that they live in, which is like optimized for whatever
to sustain the cell.
Exactly. So that's something that either you will make it in-house or you will buy it somewhere. So that's also something that enters the door a lot. Then a lot of different like staining solutions, things, dyes or antibodies, things that somehow make you able to detect what you're looking after or looking for. Enzymes, then chemical salts that you need for various other liquid solutions.
And I think maybe one way of framing it is that a lot of the things that you use in a lab, of the chemicals or the bio-things. Another time we talked of, you framed it quite nicely, that it's like a, can you say that in English, a bullion cube, that it's you're using a small part of something where a lot of materials and energy went into this. So basically, like a sauce at a fine restaurant that it started in a 5-liter pot with red wine and and you spend a lot of gas on the stove to reduce it, and then you end up with a great tiny product that can do a lot of things, but a lot went in to using that. So if it's detection liquids or others, that even if it's only 10 milliliter, a lot went into creating those 10 milliliter.
Yeah, and even in a lab scale, I mean, you also buy small vials of something where you have maybe 50 microliters, right? Which is basically not a lot. I mean, if you cry, then you cry more than you would find in that vial, right? And that vial is super expensive, and it has the same climate impact as like a full cupboard of all kinds of other things, right? But like size and volume and price and carbon impact, there's no correlation whatsoever. And that's a tricky one, because we used to go like the plastic, it takes up a lot of space. It's like, we know it's horrible for a lot of reasons, so we focus a lot on that, but we forget that even the tiniest vial of something could be impactful to do something about.
Where do we start? Let's say I'm a lab manager or an R&D manager in a pharmaceutical company, and I am basically being measured on how to progress my research forward. Is there knowledge being generated? Are we taking the research through the proper phases and so on? And those are my KPIs and how I need to be responsible for my leader and the leader to the next leader and so on. So where do we start in that context?
I think the best start of a lab change is to let the lab users look at their work environment, because they know what's doable and what's not. Because one thing that you can easily implement in one lab may not be implementable in another lab, right? So I think like giving the lab users the power and the opportunity to actually chip in with ideas, because they have done the same workflows many times, or they change workflows all the time, and they know exactly where they are losing time or where they are using. Like, we always set up this workflow, but very often we only need 10% of the output. So why don't we just scale it down? So I think like,
and that has another very nice side effect, that I mean, when we're trying to create impact, we want to create lasting impact. And given that it's driven by the habits of the lab users, they will have a higher degree of ownership if it's coming from themselves. And that's a key thing that we've seen in Green Innovation Group with all the innovation and change management projects that we do. That sure, I mean, we know roughly what needs to come out and what green initiatives that needs to happen, but it's much better to build it bottom up from whether that's in facility management or in production or in the labs.
Yeah, and I think for two reasons. One is the ownership and the support that they will naturally show, but also that there are many. Even though I know a lot about green labs, I still can't say exactly what all the best potentials are in a lab, because if I was there maybe as a person standing in the corner for a month, then maybe I would be like, okay, I see a pattern here. There's something here, but the lab users already know this. And if you give them the opportunity, and if you let them try to look at their workflows with new eyes, then they can come up with really, really good ideas that benefit like both like the planet, but also health and safety and money-wise and their time. So I think that's where everything should start, like letting the lab users come up with ideas, and then maybe you can't run away with all of them, but maybe you can pick those that are most easy to implement, just to like have some like quick wins you can showcase to get support. You could also go for the really high impact ones, maybe a combination, but it needs to be prioritized, and someone needs to have it as part of their job description, because it's not just going to happen in between people's normal jobs. And that's currently what I see, that there are some green heads that really want to change things, but they don't get the time allocated for it, and that means it doesn't really take off.
And we see that everywhere where we're working with pharmaceutical and medtech companies, that some CEO and board of directors has planted a flag in 2030, but more often in 2050, and say we have to be carbon neutral by this day. And then the tasks and the work streams are thrown onto people's normal jobs. And sure, there are some sustainability positions being created, but mostly it's just thrown on top. And then it doesn't get prioritized. So that's definitely part of a larger pattern. So it needs to come from the lab users, and someone needs to own it and have it as part of their job.
And I think, not just like, of course, someone has to drive it and actually be, let's call it project manager on it, but the lab users also need to have time for this, right? Because they are the people or the targets for the change, right? They are the ones who will actually feel it on their like in their everyday lives. So we also need to accept that they will spend some time in creating new habits, or trying new things, or validating new procedures, or whatever. And that's really what's missing in my point of view.
And so when we're working with changing habits and changing people, there are various frameworks. Regarding habits, I can really recommend the book Atomic Habits for any listeners out there. But also some key components are to make it easy, but also to make it attractive. And given that the core unit is the lab user, what's in it for the lab user? Or how do you make that come to life, so to say? I think, there are so many different things you could do in a lab, and depending on how keen people are on sacrificing things for the greenness, you can pick some, right? So I think, especially in research labs and in academia, it's generally less structured than if you go to a well set up industrial lab. And if you, for example, start creating inventories for all the regions you have, there are certain regions that by law you need to have inventories for. What's a region in this context?
So, like what's a region? Good question. So, for example, if you buy something that isn't a chemical, but could be, for example, a biological substance, it could be an enzyme, a freeze-dried protein, or something that doesn't fit into the chemistry category, but it somehow has a biological function, maybe. For now, let's say that's a region. And in some labs, they have really nice overviews of everything they have. Everything has a number. It's put into a database. You can look it up, like control find, you know exactly where it is, how much we have of it, how you order it, and all of these things. And like keeping inventories mean you increase the chances that things will actually be used before it expires, instead of things going missing somewhere and double purchasing, something expiring because we never actually knew where it was and these things. So that's green, because we make sure we know what we have and where to find it. But it's also so nice for a lab user that you know where to find stuff and what we have. You waste so much time looking through all kinds of drawers and the wrong freezers and asking in offices if anybody saw this reagent. So that's, for example, that's an example of a green action. Makes their everyday life better. Exactly, as well. Where it simply makes lab life easier. So, for example, if your colleagues or if this certain group is very resistant to changes, then pick the green actions where they see an immediate positive effect in their daily life. So, for example, inventories could be one thing, right? Also, for example, if you make good habits of turning off equipment, like in many labs, the equipment is just constantly turned on because time is the most valuable resource, and we can't wait for things to get ready. But for most equipment, the equipment lifetime is shortened if it's not turned off regularly, right? And it's really annoying to work in a lab where things need to get repaired all the time. Or where, you know, you have this thing, but it only works for 2 years, and then you have to wait for the repair person to come out. They have to order spare parts, then they come back, they can't repair it. Like, that's also...
and the lab manager comes and say, we're spending too much money on this.
And then you anyway end up losing a lot of time, right? Even though you kept it on all the time to not lose time. But like these things where it actually has really nice spillover effects on just the workflow in the lab, that you know where you can find things, and you know that you can trust the equipment works, and things like that.
So that's definitely one key beneficial output from this, is that you can have a better lab life, which whatever your goals in the lab are, translated into better research, better product development, whatever it might be. What are some of the other benefits that can come from this that are, I mean, not planetary benefits, which are obviously huge and would probably be yours and mine main motivation, but we also know when driving the change in the green agenda, that whenever we can speak through a different existing logic, like financially or well-being, it's actually more powerful than just speaking to the green agenda.
For sure. I think health is definitely also a good argument to go green in the lab, and that's kind of divided in two. There's like the whole global health, the climate change agenda, but there's also the local and very here and now health that, for example, like a fume hood, which is like, it's this box in a way that you work in if you work with something that is toxic to you, that you should not be inhaling or get in your eyes.
It's a bit like when I make soup at home on my stove, that there's
the suction.
The suction.
Just much more energy consuming. So it runs to sort of suck out the air to make sure that you don't get anything in your face, right? So one thing is that the pump needs electricity, but it also basically sucks out all the air that we just heated up in the room. So you need to constantly warm up the room. But anyway, if you keep that open, it consumes much more energy, but it's also much more unsafe to be in the lab. Whereas the longer you keep it, like the lower you keep it, the safer it is, because all the toxic stuff is in here, right? So it's good both planet-wise, but also safety-wise. And for a lot of equipment also, like if you keep it on constantly, and remember most equipment in a lab consumes much more energy than the appliances we have at home. Like the air will also become very tense or like dense. So it's very warm to work in a lab also, and that's also not great for us. Then there are things like, for example, in production labs, sometimes they produce bigger volumes than they need simply because that's what the equipment is validated for, but carrying that is not great for anyone's back, for example. But if they could actually just produce what they need to ship on anyway, that would be better in terms of their health. So health is definitely also a good reason to do some of the actions at least.
And I'm sensing a bit of a key principle in here that is going from sort of a better safe than sorry regarding everything, rather overdo something than risk it not being done. Be that in temperature or in dosing or other things, to working towards the appropriate amount of whatever that is. The equipment being turned on appropriately, the cooling, the sterile. That sounds like more complex decision making as well, and more responsibility on the lab users.
I think, for example, for a lot of equipment, it's turned on very well in advance because we're afraid that I'm gonna lose time if it's not ready. But very often it's also because we're not exactly sure how long it takes for something to get ready. So then our default thought is it's probably half an hour. But for a lot of equipment, you can turn it on and 7 minutes later it's ready. So if one person goes through the lab, turns on each appliance and takes the time and writes it on the piece of appliance, this appliance takes 7 minutes to get ready, then you don't. It's not a lot of decision making anymore. But you know that if you need it at 10, you don't have to turn it on the moment you enter the lab at 8. But you need some kind of overview. Like people need to know how long does it take, but also which pieces of equipment am I actually allowed to turn off, because some of it you cannot turn off. So it requires some common decisions in the lab. But I wouldn't say it's too complex. It's about changing habits, really.
Sounds like it's actually very, very practical at habit changing, despite that we're in this very high-tech, high-knowledge environment, that the actual solutions that we need are
very simple.
Yeah, very simple.
Right?
I mean, it doesn't mean it's easy, but it's simple.
Exactly. Yeah. And then I think another benefit, but that's like it depends on maybe the level of power that I speak to. I think for the lab users, I focus on the actions where they will feel that lab life becomes easier. On a management level, for example, in academia, I would say you end up saving a lot of money from all the equipment that doesn't need repair or replacement really early. Like group leaders in academia don't really care about the electricity bill because they don't pay it. They pay with their overhead, right? But in the industry, they do care about it, and electricity is really expensive at the moment. So that's a good argument, right? Then there's funding, like in academia at least. It will be difficult to get funding for your research within this decade if you can't prove or show that you have taken green actions in your lab. In the industry, I would say, I mean, your investors are going to care about this. So like money as an argument.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, if you're in the private industry, there's a lot of things. There's one, the need to be a preferred clinical partner, where like whether that is coming from the healthcare systems, where everybody's sustainability goals is spilling over to one another. So as soon as you're partnering up with something, I mean, that's a demand. But also at the other end of the supply chain, at the forefront of the market, to get through procurement in a healthcare system in the future, your products will have to be green or greener at least. And that starts in the lab when we're in a pharmaceutical setting.
For sure.
So I think it's hard to understate the lock-in effect that, yes, maybe these are products that won't be on the market for the next 10, 15 years, but they're sort of creating the frame that they will be produced in and eventually sold in.
And then after 10, 15 years, they will be on the market for maybe 30, 50 years, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point.
I think maybe the last really good argument for going green, which we also touched a little bit upon in the first episode we did together, is people and keeping your employees happy, but also attracting talents in the future. So at the university, it's like both students and staff. In the industry, of course, it's staff. But already now we see that people really care about this. And like I mean, when Greta's generation is starting to look for labs and places to study and work, and I mean, they will care about whether you're green or not in the lab. So it will be a competition parameter, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So I think there are many good arguments, but depending on which like power level you're in, I would use different arguments for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's a great meta point as well, that you need to make the argument that makes sense for each individual at whatever level they're at. I think that goes throughout the whole green transition, but another good example here where the things that the lab user care about, or the lab leader, or the overall R&D manager, or university manager are completely different things.
Exactly.
But they can all sort of coexist within the same changes, but they just need to be framed differently. That someone cares about the electricity bill, someone doesn't care at all about the electricity bill. And I also think your argument that there's a balance between tackling the highest emissions or the highest environmental impact issues first, but also to go into what is highly visible and what makes someone feel good. And I think, in my opinion, it all needs to happen. And the small change that's highly visible and feels good often unlocks larger changes. So it shouldn't be seen as a bad thing. But I think sometimes people don't do the small things because they don't want to be accused of greenwashing or something like that. What's your take on that and structuring the change? And
I agree very much with you. I think if everybody started off being climate activists, then maybe you didn't have to go for the small impact, highly visible things. But in a normal work setting, you'll have a mix of people, right? Where some people are very much aware of the true impact of different things, and others are not. And that's normal because we are all, or many of us, are not well studied in climate impact, right? So I think it's really important to start with things that are visible to give motivation. And so in a lab setting, I also think, like, if you look at the climate impact, then sorting your plastic waste is not going to make a huge difference compared to all the other things you could do in a lab. But it means a lot to people because that's the most obvious environmental impact their work has. So for the people in the lab, it's important, and you sort of have to check that box before you can exactly unlock the other actions and do more stuff, because electricity is so difficult to grasp.
Yeah, it is.
And you can see that it's turned on, you can feel the heating in the room, but actually grasping it, that's just almost impossible. So you need to, I really think you need to combine the two, but also don't get lost in printing double-sided and sorting plastic because then
you can spend a lot of time on something that doesn't do a lot of impact. So what are the 3 most impactful things you can do in a lab? If resources is not or time is not a problem, like what would be the 3 most impactful things?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is a huge thing, right? But that's like looking at the protocols with critical eyes and determining.
And a protocol, what is that?
So that could be a description of a particular workflow. So if you want to investigate whether this drug has an effect on this cell, then you start with this material, you end up with a result saying yes or no, or so many %. So that could be one experiment. So a protocol for each experiment is probably what we have in a lab, right? So looking at the protocols, the standard procedures, and be like, could we get the same out of it, but with less resources? So scaling down, skipping a step, using less of a reagent. Sometimes the manufacturers are saying that you should dilute it 1 to 10, but you can actually do it 1 in 1,000, and it still works out nicely. So taking a look at the standard procedures and being like, could we just reduce? So that would definitely be the most impactful thing. Then the other thing would be to share equipment much more. I think there are many cases, both in the industry and in academia, of like a lot of duplicated equipment that is not used to its fullest capacity at all. Where if we would use the same equipment, we could save a lot of money, but importantly, the whole embodied carbon in the equipment could have been avoided. And generally just sharing is really, really great. Also with reagents and materials and all of this, so things don't expire. Then maybe the last thing I would say is like really being attentive to the suction, so all of the air circulation, because that's really like consuming a lot of electricity, but also taking all of the heated air out of the rooms. So making sure it's off when you don't need it, or turn to the lowest level whenever you can, all of that, because that is the largest energy consumer in the lab.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that was a really good wrap up, and hopefully tangible for people. Thank you so much for coming. This is a really exciting and important area. If people want to reach you, where can they do that?
They can go to my website and find my contact details. So that would be www.avasustain.com. So avasustain.com. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming, Nikoline.
Thanks for the invitation.
My pleasure. This was a super nice podcast to do with Nikoline. I really learned a ton, and I love how practical a lot of the change is and how doable it is. So I hope this has inspired a lot of lab users and lab leaders out there to start doing something, anything. And if you want to do this on a more organized level, you are of course welcome to reach out to Nikoline or us at Greenifying Group. We also collaborate on doing projects together. And good luck out there in decarbonizing the healthcare industry. Tune in to another episode next week.